Ask a Vietnam veteran what made river crossings dangerous, and you'll hear the answers most people expect. Enemy fire from the opposite bank. Ambushes hidden in the tree line. The moment when a unit broke formation in the water and became exposed. But stay with them long enough, and the answer changes. Their voice slows, their eyes drift, and they start talking about the water itself, not as terrain, not as scenery, but as something alive, something that couldn't be read, couldn't be trusted, and never fully revealed what was beneath it. For the men who served in Vietnam, water was never neutral. Rivers weren't just routes on a map. They were places where control slipped away, where visibility disappeared, where balance, footing, and certainty vanished the moment a boot broke the surface. If you're a veteran watching this, you already know the feeling, the hesitation at the riverbank, the way sound changed, the way the current pulled without warning, the knowledge that once you were in, you were committed. There was no cover, no easy retreat, no clear idea of what waited below. For everyone else, this is what needs to be understood. Vietnam's water wasn't just dangerous because of the enemy. It was dangerous because it hid everything. Roots, debris, disease, animals, and sometimes things that were never clearly identified at all. In Vietnam, water didn't announce itself as a threat. It waited, and once you stepped into it, you were no longer in control. Vietnam's geography ensured that no unit could avoid water for long. The country was cut through by rivers that twisted and branched like veins, feeding deltas, swamps, mangroves, and rice paddies that stretched for miles. Monsoon rains transformed dry ground into shallow lakes overnight. Trails disappeared beneath floodwater. Riverbanks collapsed without warning. Entire patrol routes changed with the seasons. For American soldiers, movement almost always meant crossing water, moving alongside it, or living directly on top of it. Rivers were lifelines. They carried supplies, allowed rapid movement, and connected isolated fire bases to the outside world. They were also traps. Water slowed men down. It weighed down gear. It erased tracks, but left soldiers exposed. A man crossing a river could not sprint, could not dive for cover, and could not easily return fire. The simple act of wading chest deep turned a trained infantryman into a slow, vulnerable silhouette. From the earliest days of large-scale American involvement, commanders understood the importance of Vietnam's waterways. This led to the creation and expansion of riverine units and the Brown Water Navy, tasked with patrolling inland rivers and canals. Patrol boats moved through narrow channels bordered by dense vegetation, where visibility was measured in feet and ambushes could come from any direction. For soldiers riding these boats, the water below them was just as concerning as the jungle lining the banks. But the danger was not limited to enemy fire. Rivers in Vietnam were ecosystems, not empty corridors. They were thick with plant life, animal life, and decay. Visibility underwater was often non-existent. Silt, vegetation, and runoff turned rivers into opaque brown channels where nothing could be seen beneath the surface. Soldiers stepping into water had no idea what their feet would touch next. The ground might be firm. It might vanish completely. It might be tangled with roots, debris, or something alive. River crossings were among the most stressful moments of any patrol. Units often halted at the water's edge, listening, scanning the opposite bank, and preparing for the moment when discipline would be tested. Crossing meant breaking formation. It meant noise. It meant men focused on balance rather than security. In waist-deep water, rifles had to be held overhead. Ammunition had to be protected. Radios had to stay dry. One slip could soak everything a soldier carried. Many crossings were done at night, when visibility was reduced even further. The water reflected no light. Sound behaved differently, echoing and distorting direction. Soldiers could hear insects, frogs, and splashing that made it impossible to tell whether movement was natural or hostile. Every ripple felt like a potential threat. Men moved slowly, feeling forward with their boots, testing each step before committing weight. For those who fell, panic set in quickly. Heavy packs pulled men down. Mud sucked at boots. Water filled pockets and sleeves. Regaining footing was not guaranteed. Soldiers trained extensively for combat, but very few were trained for what to do when the ground vanished beneath them in darkness. The fear was not always tied to a specific creature or threat. Often, it was the fear of the unknown. Water concealed everything. A river could hide an enemy position, submerged obstacles, sharp debris, or wildlife that could not be seen or avoided. Soldiers learned quickly that once they were in the water, they were no longer in control of the environment. They were reacting to it. The Mekong Delta presented some of the most extreme conditions. Vast networks of rivers and canals cut through farmland and villages, creating a maze of waterways that were impossible to fully secure. Brown water Navy patrols moved through these channels daily, often at close range to the banks. Vegetation leaned over the water, forming natural tunnels. Anything could be waiting just out of sight. For sailors and soldiers assigned to these patrols, falling into the water was a constant concern. Boats rocked from wakes, sudden stops, or evasive maneuvers. Men leaned over the sides to observe, to retrieve equipment, or to clear debris. A misstep could send someone into the river with no warning. What waited beneath the surface was never clear. In the central highlands and jungle regions, rivers were narrower but no less dangerous. Fast currents formed after heavy rains, turning shallow crossings into powerful flows that knocked men off balance. Flash flooding was common. A stream crossed safely in the morning could be impassable by afternoon. Units trapped on the wrong side had to wait, exposed, until water levels dropped. Water also erased time. Rivers did not hold memory the way land did. Tracks disappeared. Evidence vanished. Bodies, equipment, and debris were carried away. For soldiers, this created an unsettling sense that the environment itself was working against them, swallowing proof of what had happened and leaving only uncertainty behind. Many veterans later described water as one of the few places where they felt truly helpless. On land, training mattered. Awareness mattered. In water, all of that was reduced. The river dictated pace and direction. The current decided who stumbled. Darkness decided what could be seen. Control slipped away with every step deeper. Even rest near water carried tension. Fire bases and camps were often positioned close to rivers for supply access. At night, the sound of moving water mixed with insects and distant jungle noise. Soldiers listening from their positions could not tell what was natural and what was not. A splash might mean nothing, or it might mean something was moving closer. The psychological effect was cumulative. Day after day, men were forced to interact with an environment that never revealed itself fully. Water crossings became mental checkpoints, moments when anxiety spiked and focus narrowed. Some soldiers dreaded them more than known enemy positions, because at least those threats could be seen and planned for. Vietnam taught soldiers that danger did not always announce itself. Sometimes it waited quietly beneath the surface, hidden by murky water and tangled vegetation. The river did not rush. It did not threaten openly. It simply existed, patient and indifferent, forcing every man who entered it to surrender a measure of control. By the time many soldiers rotated home, they no longer thought of water as something safe or calming. Rivers were remembered as places of tension, vulnerability, and uncertainty. Places where anything could happen and nothing could be seen clearly. In Vietnam, water was not a backdrop to the war. It was an active participant. And for many soldiers, the deeper fear was not what they saw in the water, but what they never saw at all. For many American soldiers in Vietnam, the fear surrounding rivers was not tied to a single identifiable threat. It was tied to the understanding that once you entered the water, you surrendered visibility. And in Vietnam, Anything that removed visibility invited danger. Crocodiles were never common encounters. Most soldiers never saw one, but that did not make them irrelevant. In many ways, their rarity made them more powerful. The idea that something large, ancient, and predatory could exist beneath the same opaque water soldiers were forced to cross settled into the background of the war and stayed there. Crocodiles became part of the unspoken list of things that might be present, even if never confirmed. Saltwater crocodiles inhabited coastal regions, mangrove swamps, and river mouths, while smaller species existed farther inland. Soldiers operating near deltas, estuaries, and tidal rivers were often warned about them, usually in briefings delivered without detail. The warnings were simple. Stay out of the water when possible. Avoid lingering near the banks at night. Do not assume that shallow water meant safe water. At night, those warnings carried more weight. Rivers changed character after dark. Reflections vanished. Depth perception disappeared. The surface became a mirrorless void. Soldiers could hear movement, but could not locate it. A splash could be a fish. It could be debris. It could be something else entirely. No one could say for certain. What mattered was not how often crocodiles attacked, but how often soldiers thought about the possibility. During crossings, men avoided unnecessary movement. They stayed close to one another. They entered and exited quickly. No one lingered in the water. Even without seeing anything, fear shaped behavior. Brown water Navy crews lived with this awareness constantly. Their patrol boats moved slowly through narrow channels bordered by dense vegetation. The banks were close enough to touch in some areas. The water beneath them was dark and unreadable. Sailors leaned over the sides only when necessary. Equipment retrieval was done cautiously. Falling into the water was not treated as a joke. There were stories. Some were confirmed, some were not. A body recovered downstream without a clear cause. A disappearance explained only by speculation. A patrol that found drag marks near the water's edge. These stories circulated quietly, rarely written down, but passed between units. Whether every detail was accurate mattered less than the effect they had. They reinforced the idea that the river was not empty. For infantry units, crossings became psychological choke points. Leaders watched their men carefully, knowing that hesitation in water could spread quickly. A single stumble could disrupt the entire formation. Soldiers focused on keeping rifles dry and footing secure, but their thoughts were rarely limited to those tasks. The mind filled the gaps left by murky water. Rivers were also home to snakes, many of them venomous. Some species moved easily between water and land. Soldiers reported seeing snakes swim across channels or disappear beneath the surface when disturbed. In low visibility water, there was no way to know what shared the space. Stepping on something alive was always a possibility. Leeches added another layer of discomfort. Soldiers wading through water often emerged with blood running down their legs, unaware of when or where the leeches had attached. The bites themselves were painless at first, but the bleeding lingered. In an environment already saturated with bacteria, these wounds became entry points for infection. Disease was an ever-present concern. Rivers carried more than water. They carried waste, runoff, and decay. Soldiers immersed themselves repeatedly, sometimes with open cuts or abrasions. Skin softened from constant moisture. Small wounds refused to close. Infections developed quietly, often days after a crossing. The river followed them even after they left it. Night crossings were the worst. Darkness erased even the limited visual cues available during the day. Units relied on touch, sound, and memory to move forward. Men held onto one another's gear to avoid separation. The current tugged unpredictably. A misstep could send someone under briefly, long enough to panic, long enough to imagine what might brush against them. Soldiers learned to suppress those thoughts. Fear in water was dangerous. Panic could drown a man faster than any animal. Veterans later described learning to control breathing, to move deliberately, to ignore the sensation of unseen contact. Discipline became survival. In riverine operations, boats became temporary islands of safety. But even there, water intruded. Spray-soaked decks, equipment stayed damp. The smell of river water clung to everything. Sailors slept knowing that the hull separated them from what they could not see. That knowledge never fully faded. Some veterans recalled moments when they felt something brush their leg in the water. A log, a fish, or maybe not. There was rarely confirmation. The lack of certainty was what lingered. Those moments replayed long after the war, often more vividly than firefights where the enemy was visible. The river also shaped sound. Voices carried differently, splashing echoed. It was difficult to tell direction or distance. This heightened anxiety during night operations. Soldiers strained to interpret noises that might mean nothing or everything. The water distorted perception. Training did little to prepare men for this. Combat training emphasized land movement, cover, and engagement. Rivers were treated as obstacles, not environments. Vietnam taught otherwise. Water demanded its own respect, its own caution, its own mental adjustment. Crocodiles were rarely confirmed threats, but they didn't need to be. The river itself was enough. It hid too much. It took too much control away. Soldiers could not dominate it the way they might dominate terrain with firepower. They could only pass through and hope. Brown Water Navy personnel understood this intimately. Their patrols required constant vigilance. They watched the banks, the waterline, the surface, and the shadows beneath. Even in daylight, the river refused to reveal itself completely. At night, it became something else entirely. What united all these experiences was the sense that water was indifferent. It did not react to fear or bravery. It did not care about mission objectives. It simply existed, carrying with it everything that lived within and beneath it. By the end of their tours, many soldiers avoided water when they could. They crossed quickly. They stayed shallow. They remained alert. The river was never just a river again. It was a place where control was lost, visibility was stolen, and imagination filled the void. And beneath that surface, whether seen or not, something always waited. If crocodiles represented the fear of what might exist beneath the surface, leeches represented what soldiers knew would happen the moment they entered the water. Leeches were not rare, not mysterious, and not imagined. They were constant. Every crossing, every wade through flooded ground, every step into a rice paddy carried the certainty that something would attach itself quietly and feed. Soldiers often did not feel leeches latch on. The water dulled sensation. The movement distracted attention. Men focused on balance, spacing, and security. It was only later, once they reached dry ground, that they noticed blood running down their legs or soaking into their socks. By then, the leech was usually gone, leaving behind a wound that continued to bleed longer than expected. In isolation, leech bites were minor injuries. In Vietnam, they were not. The jungle environment turned small wounds into ongoing problems. Constant moisture prevented skin from sealing. Dirt and bacteria entered easily. Soldiers already dealing with softened skin, rashes, and abrasions found that leech bites became one more opening for infection. Water followed them out of the river and into their bodies. Disease was always present, even when invisible. Rivers carried waste, animal runoff, and decaying plant matter. Soldiers crossed with cuts on their hands, blisters on their feet, and insect bites that never fully healed. Immersion turned those small injuries into vulnerabilities. Medics treated infections that had no single cause, only accumulation. The river did not wound dramatically. It wore men down quietly. Drowning was another constant risk, rarely discussed openly, but understood by everyone. Heavy packs shifted weight unpredictably. Boots filled with water. Mud grabbed ankles and refused to let go. A man who slipped might go under briefly, just long enough to inhale water or panic. Recovery depended on luck and nearby hands. Night crossings amplified everything. Darkness removed visual anchors. Soldiers relied on touch and memory. A wrong step could send someone into deeper water without warning. Panic in water spread quickly. Veterans later described learning to suppress instinct, to slow breathing, to force calm where none came naturally. Those who failed sometimes paid for it immediately. Exhaustion compounded the danger. By the time many crossings occurred, soldiers were already drained. Heat, humidity, lack of sleep, and constant movement weakened coordination and judgment. Rivers did not care how tired a man was. They demanded the same balance and awareness regardless. A moment of fatigue could become a life-threatening mistake. Brown water Navy personnel faced these risks daily. Sailors operated in an environment where falling overboard was not theoretical. It was possible every moment. Decks were wet. Boats rocked. Sudden maneuvers were common. Recovery from the water was not guaranteed. The river moved boats forward, but it also threatened to take men away. Leeches were not confined to crossings. They appeared in boats, on gear, and inside clothing after river operations. Sailors found them attached to ankles, behind knees, and in places that made removal difficult. The discomfort lingered long after the bite itself. Bleeding continued. Infection followed. The water remained present even after leaving it. Snakes also surfaced occasionally, reminding soldiers that rivers were not empty corridors. Some species moved easily between land and water. Others remained hidden beneath the surface. Sightings were rare but unsettling. A snake slipping into the water disappeared instantly, leaving only ripples and imagination behind. What made water different from other threats was its persistence. A firefight ended. A patrol returned. An ambush was survived, but water crossings came again and again. Rivers could not be avoided indefinitely. Every operation eventually required interaction with them. The threat reset each time. The psychological toll accumulated quietly. Soldiers stopped trusting the ground beneath water. They questioned every step. They anticipated danger without being able to identify it. This constant uncertainty drained mental energy that could never be fully restored. Veterans later described feeling tense near water long after the war ended. Some avoided swimming altogether after returning home. Others found that lakes and rivers triggered memories they could not easily explain. The smell of stagnant water, the sound of slow-moving currents, even the sensation of wet clothing could bring Vietnam back without warning. The water followed them across decades. Water also erased closure. Rivers carried away evidence. Bodies were not always recovered. Equipment vanished. Events lacked clear endings. Soldiers remembered moments without resolution. A splash, a disappearance, a question that was never answered. These unfinished memories lingered longer than confirmed losses. For many veterans, water symbolized the part of the war they could never control. On land, training and discipline offered some sense of mastery. In water, that illusion collapsed. The environment dictated terms. Soldiers adapted, but they never dominated. Even moments of rest near water carried unease. Camps built close to rivers never felt fully secure. Night sounds echoed differently. Movement was harder to interpret. Soldiers listened more than they slept. The water never stopped moving, and neither did the mind. Over time, soldiers learned to treat water with the same respect they gave known enemy positions. They prepared carefully. They moved deliberately. They accepted that some risk could not be eliminated. Survival meant cooperation with the environment rather than conquest of it. Vietnam taught soldiers that war was not always about visible enemies. Sometimes it was about endurance, about navigating spaces that resisted control, about managing fear without clear cause. Water embodied all of that. The river did not choose sides. It did not respond to courage or hesitation. It carried whatever entered it, living or dead, soldier or civilian, debris or memory. It remained indifferent to purpose and sacrifice alike. By the end of their tours, many soldiers carried water with them in ways they did not expect. In scars from infections that never healed cleanly. In habits formed around avoiding wet environments. In memories that surfaced whenever control slipped away. The war inside the water did not end when soldiers stepped onto dry ground for the last time. It followed them home, quiet and persistent. It lived in recollection rather than record, in sensation rather than story. For veterans, the water of Vietnam is remembered not as scenery, but as experience, as tension, as uncertainty, as something that never fully revealed itself. The river did not need to attack openly. It only needed to exist. Vietnam's water was never safe, and for those who crossed it, it never truly left.